du meine Arbeit für richtig hältst, ob du glaubst, dass ich fleißig gewesen bin, dass ich gearbeitet habe.
Hitler wasn't a philosophical innovator. He was a synthesizer of existing prejudices, a popularizer of other people's bad ideas.
Gib du jetzt deine Stimme ab, wenn ja.
There's a photograph that haunts me. It shows rows upon rows of books burning in Berlin, 1933. Students and professors, intellectuals and scholars, feeding the flames. Among those books were works by Einstein, Freud, Marx, and Mann. The irony is almost too painful to contemplate. A movement that claimed to represent the pinnacle of Western civilization, destroying Western civilization's greatest achievements. But here's what troubles me even more. We often think of Hitler and the Nazis as anti-intellectual barbarians, as thugs who rejected philosophy and reason entirely. And while there's truth to that characterization, it's also dangerously incomplete. Because what made Nazism so devastating wasn't just the absence of thought, but the presence of bad thought, poorly understood ideas, and the weaponization of legitimate philosophy for horrific ends. Today, we're going to do something uncomfortable. We're going to examine Hitler's worldview, not as a cartoonish manifestation of pure evil, but as a system of ideas that borrowed, distorted, and perverted real philosophical traditions. Not to legitimize it, never that, but to understand how ideology becomes catastrophe. Because the scholars who've studied this most carefully have arrived at a troubling conclusion. The danger wasn't that Hitler's ideas came from nowhere. The danger was that they came from everywhere. Let's begin with a woman who changed how we think about evil itself. Hannah Arendt sat in a Jerusalem courtroom in 1961, watching Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust. She expected to see a monster. Instead, she saw something that disturbed her far more: a mediocre bureaucrat. A man who spoke in cliches, who never had an original thought, who simply followed orders and climbed the ladder of success within a genocidal system. From this observation came one of the 20th century's most important philosophical concepts: the banality of evil. Arendt argued that the greatest evils in human history don't require great villains. They require ordinary people who stop thinking critically, who accept the ready-made phrases of their society, who prioritize career advancement over moral consideration. Now apply this lens to Hitler himself. When you actually read his writings, when you wade through the turgid prose of Mein Kampf, you don't find philosophical genius. You find cliches, borrowed phrases, derivative ideas poorly stitched together. Hitler's racial theories weren't original. They were plagiarized from 19th century pseudoscientists like Houston Stewart Chamberlain and Arthur de Gobineau. His anti-Semitism wasn't new. It was medieval Christian prejudice dressed in modern scientific language. His social Darwinism was a crude misreading of actual evolutionary theory. Arendt's insight reveals something crucial. We should be less afraid of brilliant evil than of mediocre evil that doesn't recognize itself as evil at all. Hitler convinced millions of educated Germans to participate in genocide, not through sophisticated philosophy, but through the absence of philosophical thinking, through slogans that replaced analysis, through tribal identity that replaced ethics, through the comfort of certainty that replaced the discomfort of questioning. The banality of evil suggests that what we should study isn't the depth of Nazi philosophy, but its shallowness, and how that shallowness became deadly when combined with state power, modern technology, and the human tendency to obey authority.
1923, Hitler and General Ludendorff lead the abortive beer hall riots in Munich. Hitler goes to prison, and the fanatic Dr. Goebbels takes over the party. From headquarters in Munich, Goebbels screams, "We build..."
But there's another way to understand what made Hitler's worldview so seductive, and it comes from one of the 20th century's great defenders of democracy. Karl Popper fled Austria in 1937, watching his homeland fall to Nazism. In exile, he wrote The Open Society and Its Enemies, a book that asked a fundamental question: how do democracies die? How do free people choose authoritarianism? Popper's answer centered on what he called historicism, the belief that history follows iron laws leading to predetermined outcomes. Marxists believed history inevitably led to communist revolution. Nazis believed history was an eternal racial struggle that would inevitably culminate in Aryan supremacy. Different conclusions, same dangerous logic. Hitler's entire worldview was historicist. He saw history not as the story of human choices and contingencies, but as a biological inevitability. Races were engaged in a struggle for survival that had been going on since the dawn of time and would continue until one race achieved dominance. This wasn't a political position you could debate or a policy you could modify. This was, in his mind, the fundamental law of nature itself. Popper argued, this kind of thinking is fundamentally anti-rational, because if the outcome is predetermined, why bother with evidence? Why engage in debate? Why build democratic institutions that allow for course correction? The historicist already knows where history is going. Their only job is to align themselves with history's inevitable march. This explains something that often confuses people about Nazism. How could they be so technologically advanced, yet so irrational? How could they build rockets and computers while believing in blood purity and racial mysticism? Popper would say, because they had instrumental rationality without critical rationality. They were brilliant at finding means to achieve their ends, but they never questioned whether the ends themselves made sense. The Nazi state was extraordinarily efficient at logistics, at organization, at industrial production. They applied scientific methods to mass murder, but they never applied scientific thinking to their core assumptions about race, never subjected their beliefs to empirical testing, never created institutions that could challenge the Führer's vision. Popper's critique reveals that the opposite of Nazi ideology isn't just different political beliefs. It's a different approach to knowledge itself. Open societies stay open by admitting they might be wrong, by building institutions designed for error correction, by treating political questions as problems to solve rather than eternal truths to enforce. But perhaps the most unsettling analysis of how Nazism emerged comes from thinkers who saw it as the dark side of modernity itself. The Frankfurt School, a group of German Jewish intellectuals who fled Nazism, asked a question that seemed almost blasphemous. Could the Enlightenment itself have planted the seeds of fascism? Could reason, science, and progress contain the possibility of their own negation? Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer wrote their dialectic of enlightenment during World War II, trying to understand how the same Germany that produced Kant, Goethe, and Beethoven could produce Auschwitz. Their answer was disturbing. The Enlightenment had promised that reason would liberate humanity. But reason divorced from ethics, instrumental rationality aimed only at efficiency rather than justice, could become a tool of domination. The Nazis didn't reject science and rationality. They weaponized it. They used modern bureaucracy to organize genocide. They employed scientific language to justify racial hierarchies. They applied industrial methods to mass murder. The death camps weren't a rejection of Enlightenment rationality. They were a perversion of it, rationality in service of the most irrational ends imaginable. Adorno and Horkheimer saw Nazi propaganda as Enlightenment turned into mass deception. The Nazis used modern media, psychological manipulation, and systematic messaging not to educate the public, but to manufacture consent for atrocity. They created what appeared to be rational arguments for irrational positions, scientific justifications for pseudoscientific beliefs. This analysis cuts deep because it suggests that modernity itself is ambiguous. The same tools that can liberate can oppress. The same organizational capacity that can cure disease can industrialize murder. The same media technologies that can spread knowledge can spread lies. Progress isn't guaranteed. Every advancement in human capability is also an advancement in human capacity for destruction. The Frankfurt School's insight explains why educated people, scientists, doctors, and professors collaborated with Nazism. They weren't abandoning reason. They were using reason without wisdom. technique without ethics, power without responsibility. But there's a more personal, psychological dimension to understanding fascism's appeal. And for that, we turn to a psychoanalyst who asked, why do people choose authoritarianism? Erich Fromm, another refugee from Nazi Germany, explored what he called the escape from freedom. His argument was elegant and troubling. Freedom is psychologically burdensome. When traditional authorities collapse, when old certainties vanish, when we're told we can choose our own path, many people experience not liberation, but terror. Modern life, Fromm argued, offers freedom from traditional constraints, from rigid hierarchies, from predetermined life paths. But it also demands freedom to the far more difficult task of autonomous self-direction, of creating meaning in a world without guaranteed purpose, of taking responsibility for your choices. Nazism offered an escape route. Submit to the Führer, identify with the powerful state, lose your individual self in the racial collective, and you're free from the burden of freedom. You don't have to decide what's true or right or meaningful. It's all decided for you. Your role is simply to obey and belong. This explains something that economic analysis alone cannot. Why middle-class Germans, people who weren't starving or desperate, embraced Nazism. They were experiencing the psychological dislocations of modernity, the anomie of urban life, the collapse of traditional communities, the vertigo of too many choices. Hitler promised certainty in an uncertain world, belonging in an atomized society, purpose in a seemingly meaningless cosmos. Fromm's analysis is uncomfortable because it suggests that the appeal of authoritarianism isn't aberrant. It's a stand-in human temptation. Whenever freedom feels like too much responsibility, whenever complexity feels like too much confusion, whenever diversity feels like too much chaos, the authoritarian option whispers, just submit, just obey, just belong, and all this anxiety will disappear.
The avenging angel of the Führer. Kurt von Schleicher and his wife have been shot dead. Captain Ernest Röhm, once Hitler's companion, is gone.
The psychological dimension reveals that combating fascism requires more than just political arguments. It requires helping people bear the burden of freedom, building communities that provide belonging without demanding submission, creating meaning structures that offer purpose without requiring blind obedience. Now let's shift our gaze to a perspective that reveals something we often miss. Hitler's ideas weren't as European as we think. Aimé Césaire, the Martinican poet and philosopher, made an argument in his Discourse on Colonialism that shocked many European readers. What Hitler did wasn't unprecedented or un-European. It was the application of colonial logic to Europe itself. What he cannot forgive Hitler for is not the crime in itself, the crime against man. It is the crime against the white man. It is the humiliation of the white man. And the fact that he applied to Europe colonialist procedures, which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria, the coolies of India, and the blacks of Africa. Think about what Hitler called for: Lebensraum, living space, the idea that Germany needed to expand eastward, exterminating or enslaving the native populations to make room for German settlers. This wasn't new. This was how Europeans had treated the Americas, Africa, Australia, the genocide of indigenous peoples, the establishment of racial hierarchies, the justification of conquest through claims of civilizational superiority. All of this had been standard European practice for centuries. Hitler's racial theories didn't emerge from nowhere. They synthesized existing European and American ideas about racial hierarchy. The United States had Jim Crow laws and immigration restrictions based on race. The British Empire governed hundreds of millions of colonial subjects as racial inferiors. The Belgians had turned the Congo into a charnel house. The Germans themselves had committed genocide against the Herero and Nama peoples in Southwest Africa. What made the Holocaust uniquely horrifying wasn't that Europeans had never done such things before. It was that Europeans did it to other Europeans and did it with industrial efficiency in the heart of civilization. The methods were modern, but the logic was colonial. This post-colonial lens reveals how deeply embedded racist thought was in Western civilization. Hitler didn't have to invent racism. He could draw from a deep well of existing theory and practice. His innovation, if you can call it that, was turning the tools of empire inward. The post-colonial critique demands we examine not just how Nazism was defeated, but how the ideologies that fed it continue in other forms. It asks uncomfortable questions about whose suffering we recognize as atrocity and whose we accept as the normal cost of empire. Let's turn now to a case study in philosophical misappropriation. What the Nazis did to Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche died in 1900, never knowing that the Third Reich would claim him as their philosopher. When you visit the Nietzsche archive in Weimar, you can still see the portraits of Hitler that once hung there, placed by Nietzsche's sister Elizabeth, who carefully edited her brother's work to make it seem compatible with Nazism. The irony is almost total. Nietzsche despised German nationalism, calling it a disease and an idiocy. He despised anti-Semitism, breaking with Wagner partly over Wagner's anti-Semitism. He despised the state, calling it the coldest of all cold monsters. He celebrated individual excellence and despised herd mentality. His ideal was the autonomous individual who creates their own values, not the submissive mass man who obeys authority. But the Nazis took Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, the overman, and read it as Aryan's Superman. They took his critique of slave morality and read it as justification for enslaving others. They took his will to power and read it as justification for military conquest. Every subtle argument became a crude slogan. Every psychological insight became racial ideology. Every call for self-overcoming became a call for dominating others. Walter Kaufmann spent decades demonstrating how systematic this distortion was. The Nazis didn't just misread Nietzsche accidentally. They actively perverted his philosophy, taking a radical individualist and turning him into a prophet of collectivist nationalism. This reveals something important about how bad ideas spread. They don't need to invent entirely new philosophies. They can hijack existing ones, strip away nuance and context, keep the prestigious name while gutting the actual content. It's easier to sell authoritarianism if you can claim Nietzsche, Darwin, or science itself supports it, even if you have to lie about what those thinkers actually said. The lesson here is about intellectual vigilance. Every philosophy can be weaponized. Every thinker can be misappropriated. The defense isn't to stop doing philosophy, but to read carefully, to insist on context, to distinguish between what someone actually argued and what others claim they argued. There's one more lens we need to examine, one that sees Hitler's ideology through the lens of economic interest. Marxist scholars like Georg Lukács argued that we can't understand Nazism purely as a set of ideas. We have to understand whose interests those ideas served. In this view, Hitler's ideology was capitalism's response to crisis, a way to preserve existing property relations and class hierarchies while channeling working-class anger away from economic elites and toward racial scapegoats. The Nazi relationship with business was complex. They weren't simply puppets of corporations, but they also weren't revolutionaries who threatened capitalist ownership. Instead, they offered German industrialists a deal. Keep your factories, keep your profits, and we'll destroy the labor movement, rearm the nation, and provide you with slave labor. IG Farben, Krupp, Volkswagen, many of Germany's largest corporations collaborated enthusiastically. Meanwhile, Hitler offered German workers psychological compensation for economic subordination. You might be poor, you might be exploited, but you're Aryan, you're racially superior to Jews, Slavs, Romani. Your material conditions might be degrading, but your identity is elevated. It's a kind of racist welfare state, where benefits flow according to blood purity rather than need. Lukács saw this as false consciousness, ideology that makes oppressed people identify with their oppressors by giving them someone even lower to look down on. The material base was capitalism in crisis. The ideological superstructure was racial nationalism. Together, they preserved elite power while mobilizing mass support. This economic analysis reveals that ideas don't float free from material interests. Hitler's philosophy appealed to specific groups for specific reasons. Industrialists liked the promise of union busting and rearmament. The middle class liked the promise of order and status. The unemployed liked the promise of jobs and purpose. Each group heard what they wanted to hear, and the consequence was catastrophe. The Marxist lens reminds us that when examining ideology, we should always ask, who benefits? Whose interests does this worldview serve? What material conditions make these ideas appealing? So what do we make of all this? What can we learn from examining Hitler's philosophy through these different scholarly lenses? First, the sheer intellectual derivativeness of it all. Hitler wasn't a philosophical innovator. He was a synthesizer of existing prejudices, a popularizer of other people's bad ideas. His anti-Semitism came from centuries of European Christian tradition. His racial theories came from 19th century pseudoscience. His nationalism came from romantic German mythology. His social Darwinism came from misreadings of Darwin. His authoritarian political theory came from critiques of democracy that long predated him. This is important because it means the danger doesn't come from uniquely powerful evil philosophies. It comes from common bad ideas, widely available prejudices, that under the right conditions can be mobilized for catastrophic ends. Second, the role of what we might call intellectual mediocrity. Arendt's banal evil, Popper's closed thinking, the Frankfurt School's instrumental rationality all point to the same thing: the absence of critical thought. What made Nazism possible wasn't too much philosophy, but too little. Not too much questioning, but too little. Not too much individual judgment, but too little. Third, the psychological and social appeal of authoritarianism. Fromm's escape from freedom, the promise of certainty in uncertain times, belonging in atomized societies, purpose in seemingly meaningless existence. These psychological needs are permanent features of human life, which means the authoritarian temptation is always with us. Fourth, the continuity between Nazism and broader Western traditions. The postcolonial critique shows that Hitler's racial theories weren't aberrations. They were variations on themes that had long dominated European imperial thought. This means we can't treat Nazism as purely other, as completely foreign to Western civilization. We have to grapple with how it emerged from Western civilization. Fifth, the importance of protecting philosophy from perversion. The Nietzsche case shows how any thinker can be misappropriated, how sophisticated ideas can be turned into crude slogans. Intellectual traditions require active defense, careful reading, insistence on context and nuance. Sixth, the relationship between ideas and interests. The Marxist analysis reminds us that ideologies don't float free. They serve purposes, they benefit groups, they emerge from and reinforce material conditions. Understanding why bad ideas spread requires understanding who they serve. But here's what might be most important. Every one of these analyses, from Arendt to Fromm to Césaire to Popper, was written by someone trying to prevent it from happening again. These weren't academic exercises. These were urgent attempts by people who had witnessed or fled catastrophe to understand how civilization could fail so completely. And what they concluded, across their different methods and perspectives, was this: the threat is permanent. The psychological appeal of authoritarianism doesn't go away. The temptation to tribal thinking doesn't disappear. The human capacity for cruelty in service of ideology doesn't fade. Every generation has to relearn why democracy matters, why critical thinking matters, why pluralism matters, why human rights matter. The scholars who examined Hitler's philosophy most carefully didn't find a uniquely powerful evil ideology. They found common human weaknesses exploited with modern tools. They found ordinary prejudices organized with state power. They found pseudo-rationality deployed with deadly efficiency. They found people desperate for certainty, led by people cynical enough to provide it, which means the defense against such movements isn't just political or legal. It's intellectual and psychological. It requires teaching people to think critically rather than accept ready-made answers. It requires building societies that can bear diversity without fracturing. It requires creating meaning structures that don't require scapegoating others. It requires institutions designed for error correction rather than enforcing orthodoxy. The examination of Hitler's philosophy through these various lenses isn't an exercise in moral relativism or in finding hidden depths where there are none. It's an exercise in understanding how catastrophe happens, how civilizations fail, how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary evil. Because the uncomfortable truth these scholars force us to confront is this: it wasn't aliens who built Auschwitz, it was humans, educated humans, civilized humans, modern humans. And the ideas that made it possible weren't from some alien ideology completely foreign to Western thought. They were distortions, perversions, and exaggerations of ideas that already existed within it. The point of studying this isn't to find Hitler's ideas interesting or worthy. It's to understand how bad ideas become catastrophic, how philosophy can be weaponized, how the tools of civilization can be turned toward barbarism. It's to learn to recognize the warning signs, to understand the psychological appeals, to build defenses not just in law, but in culture and thought. Every generation faces these questions anew. Every society has to decide whether to be open or closed, whether to think critically or accept authority, whether to embrace complexity or demand simple certainty, whether to protect human rights or sacrifice them for tribal belonging. The scholars who examined Hitler's worldview weren't trying to make it respectable. They were trying to make it impossible again. Their work is a warning, carefully researched and urgently delivered. This can happen. It has happened. It could happen again, unless we understand it, unless we resist it, unless we build the intellectual, institutional, and moral defenses necessary to prevent it. That's the real lesson from examining Nazi ideology through these different philosophical lenses. Not that it was uniquely evil and we're safely distant from it, but that it emerged from human tendencies, social conditions, and intellectual traditions that are always with us, and therefore requires eternal vigilance. The question these scholars leave us with isn't, how could they have done this? It's, how do we ensure we don't?